All right, folks. Look, on this auspicious occasion, it's Thom Yorke's 50th birthday today, and it makes me feel old because I'm not far behind him. I'm 10 years behind him. I got into Radiohead pretty young when the Bends came out. I was obsessed with Radiohead immediately, and yeah, sort of followed through their career with a lot of interest as the years have gone on. And I thought, what better way to mark this occasion than to give my worst to best Radiohead album opinion, I guess. Look, it's only an opinion. It might change tomorrow. Let's just go with it, right? My I'm not going to say the worst Radiohead album, but my least favourite Radiohead album would probably be the same as a lot of other people's. Pablo Honey, their first offering, 1993. It's a good album. It sort of broke at an interesting time. It broke when the grunge thing was still happening in America, and in some ways it's sort of reminiscent of that period in production and maybe the way in which we view or listen to some of the songs at the time may have been affected by the fact that what we expected from alternative rock at that time was grunge. And so, Radiohead weren't really doing grunge, but we were sort of interpreting it through the lens of grunge, perhaps. And so it sort of it sort of skewed the reception of the album. I think, like in retrospect, I think it's actually a better album than what we perhaps believed at the time. I mean, they're a British band. They weren't trying to compete with Seattle, and in many respects. Some of the contents of Pablo Honey sort of set up what happened later with the Bends and even OK Computer a little bit. There's some really good songs on Pablo Honey. I mean, Creep's the obvious one, and frankly, I think it's one of Radiohead's least interesting songs. I've never really been into Creep. I get why it's a hit. I get why it's become sort of a meme almost. But in terms of the depth of the song, it's not doing much more than sort of self-wallowing. I think there's more interesting material on the album. I really like the opener, You, some really interesting guitar work. The fact that Radiohead at this time had three guitar players, I mean, they still have the same members these days, but the members don't always play guitar. Whereas back then they were essentially always playing guitar. And so You is a really good show off of their capabilities as a three guitar, five-piece band. There's some great sort of weaving in and out of the guitar parts. It's quite assaulting. One of my favourites on the album. Just looking at the track list, Stop Whispering is a really great track as well. I think that doesn't get enough attention. It does a sort of Pixies thing with the soft loud. But it's not just a merciless sort of rip-off of the American Seattle / Pixies thing. It's trying to you can hear them trying to develop some kind of identity, like a sonic musical identity in the song. Thom Yorke's vocals are great from the outset. I think he's always been a great singer, and a song like Stop Whispering makes that really clear, I think. Anyone Can Play Guitar might be my favourite on this one. That's a real... it's kind of funny. Like, Radiohead don't often show off their sense of humour. The title is funny in and of itself, Anyone Can Play Guitar. Because at the time, that was kind of true. What people were doing was starting bands because they heard that some American nobody band started a band and got really famous, so I'm going to start a band, and that's sort of happened ever since. And it's Radiohead's kind of take on that, I think. The guitar playing on the song is extraordinary, of course. Johnny Greenwood's solo throughout the song is extraordinary. I think finally Blowout needs a mention. Blowout's the final song on the album. great track. It's probably the most forward-looking of the tracks here. I think it's I'm not going to say it's prog, but it's it's an interesting arrangement. What the band does in terms of the tempo change, the sort of the dynamic crescendo is really interesting. It's not a standard alternative 90s rock album by any means, and I think songs like the ones I've mentioned sort of prove that. At the time when it was released, you never would have anticipated that the following albums were to come from this band, but there's little clues, I think. There's little clues on this record that they're not a standard guitar band, So Pablo Honey, I think, doesn't get quite the recognition it deserves in light of their later stuff, but I really enjoy listening to it occasionally. The next one I picked, I don't know how controversial this is, The King of Limbs is one of my least favourite ones. It's a good album. I think when this came out, I wasn't as into Radiohead anymore as I used to be, and so I possibly didn't give it the time or the patience that an album like this might need. I do put it on occasionally and sort of try and get it a bit more. It sounds good. It sounds really polished. It sounds very analysed. It almost sounds over-analysed. It sounds very almost sanitized. It's got this sort of sheen, not a sheen, but a sort of metronomic type coldness to it, which I'm not sure I naturally enjoy. I think it's objectively good, but subjectively, it leaves me not as not as excited as their other releases, which I will mention soon. Just looking at the tracks here, that they start to sound a little bit samey after a little while. For me, it's a sort of mood piece. I see this album as a mood piece, like start to finish. It's a similar journey every song, and so yeah. Look, I can take it or leave it, but again, objectively, it's good. But I think in 2011, when it came out, I'd sort of moved on a bit from what Radiohead were currently doing, and so feel free to disagree with me. If you think The King of Limbs is the best thing they've recorded, please tell me in the comments. The next one I've picked is their most recent offering, A Moon-Shaped Pool, maybe for similar reasons. Again, I've put it on quite a bit since it's come out, but not in any kind of regular way. Just in an attempt to kind of let it instill itself on me slowly and in a sort of organic way. I do like it. It's not as cold sounding for me as The King of Limbs. It sounds very warm. It reminds me a little bit of Hail to the Thief, which I will mention soon, in terms of its diversity, its musical diversity and the range of tempos and textures and things like that they're going for. Burn the Witch, the first single, I did enjoy. The strings are very well arranged, of course, and again, objectively I can tell it's great, but maybe I just wasn't in the headspace when it came out. I think I was, again, not paying a huge amount of attention to Radiohead. When was it? 2016. So, yeah, look, I will put it on more, and maybe this album will, increase its standing in terms of my positioning of it in their discography. But for now, it's not something I go to very much. The next one I've chosen is Amnesiac. I had to think very carefully between this one and the next one. I love Amnesiac. I think it's a great album. I guess the only fault I see is that it's very short, and it sort of got overshadowed a bit by the fact that Kid A came very soon before it was released, and so people were still processing Kid A when Amnesiac came out, and so I think maybe people just didn't give it the time and attention that it perhaps deserved. I might be guilty of that. I mean, looking at the track list now, every track is killer. Pyramid Song is one of their greatest ever songs. It's just timeless and always changes the mood of the room immediately. You and Who's Army is still great. I might be wrong. Knives Out. I mean, these are all classic Radiohead songs, and again, maybe I'm putting this down the bottom of the list unfairly, or near the bottom of the list unfairly. But there's also just so much greatness to come as well. I think, you have to make some hard decisions when you rank Radiohead's albums, and this is not a reflection of how bad Amnesiac is. It's a fantastic album, but, they've released better ones. So I think that's my third one. The fourth one I'm going to talk about is Hail to the Thief. And again, this sort of feels really unfair to Hail to the Thief, because I love Hail to the Thief. When this came out, they hadn't released something for a few years, since Amnesiac actually, and it was very welcome. We couldn't wait to hear another Radiohead album, and it was long and complex, and it sort of went everywhere musically. And yeah, look, I mean, I had this on for a long time when it came out, and still put it on occasionally. It's not doing anything particularly different for the band. I think it was a bit of a transitional album for them. Just looking at the track list, there were songs which reminded the listener of different stages of their career, maybe. Like 2 + 2 is 5 was sort of reminiscent of the last two albums, Kid A and Amnesiac. Ditto for Sit Down, Stand Up, Sail to the Moon. But other songs reminded us a bit more of, sort of OK Computer era or Ben's era with the more guitar thing going on. It was a bit of a conglomeration of different eras of Radiohead. There is the standout for me on this album. There's just amazing. The slow build and intensity and the mood of that song is pretty extraordinary. So, it's a great album start to finish, but some clear highlights as well. Love a Wolf at the Door, Myxomatosis, Where I End and You Begin is amazing as well. Sail to the Moon, it's a fantastic album. And I can't believe this is in the bottom half of this list. So there you go. The fifth one, In Rainbows. And look, I loved In Rainbows when it came out. This was 2008. I had sort of moved on a bit from Radiohead in those intervening years. And sort of came back to them a little bit with In Rainbows. This did more, not more, but it did a lot for the way music is distributed within the industry as it does musically. It's an important album, not just for its music, but for the way in which Radiohead handled its release, because this was their first album post their contract with Parlophone, with EMI. And so, the fact that they put it on the internet and people could pay what they wanted for it, and, they sort of proved to the industry that the old industry was no longer required, really. Artists could operate their own businesses effectively. And so, that side of In Rainbows for me was very important, and for a lot of people was very important. If you're in bands, certainly that was really important. But musically, I see it as a really good album, but not something I want to revisit in terms of, personal attachment to the music very much. Again, objectively, I can tell it's great, but time and place was important for me, I think, and still is important for me. And when it came out, I was listening to mostly, different sort of genres of music, and In Rainbows, as impressive as it is, was very different to the stuff that I was into at the time. I think I was going through my alt country phase at the time, so listening to, Ryan Adams and Whiskey Town, and then listening to 15 Step was a bit of an extreme contrast. Nude is one of my faves on this. Nude's an extraordinary song. I remember watching Meeting People Is Easy, that documentary that they made on the OK Computer tour, when that came out, I think in the late 90s, and they played a very early version of Nude at one of the concerts in that documentary, and I remember sort of thinking, what the hell's this song? Like, why haven't they released this song yet? And finally we got it, like a decade later. It came out on In Rainbows, and a very different arrangement compared to the 10-year earlier arrangement or version. But yeah, it was worth the wait. I think this whole album is meticulously produced, meticulously arranged, but a bit like some of the other ones, I've got to be in the right sort of frame of mind for it, I guess. So look, we're getting into top 3 territory, I think, aren't we? We are. Kid A would be the next one. I mean, what to say about Kid A that hasn't already been said? It's amazing. When this came out, I was ready to receive what Radiohead had to say after OK Computer. There'd been what felt like a very long wait between 1997 and I think this was 2000. 3 years these days is nothing, but back then it felt like a long time, particularly in light of the fact that OK Computer was such a almost like a tablet from the gods. We couldn't wait to have another tablet, and so finally the tablet arrived, and it was absolutely worth the wait. I mean, this is an extraordinary album. Everything in its right place, of course, sets the sort of mood. The title track is sort of nicely weird. I feel like this sort of set the parameters for the next decade. I think every indie rock album was trying to sort of emulate Kid A in a way between about 2000 and 2010. No one pulled it off as well, though, of course, because they're just great. They're, the original artifact is always the best artifact, I guess. The national anthem's incredible. How to Disappear Completely. Every song's just stunning. And I feel the fact that this is the 3rd ranked album on a list and it's such a stunning recording suggests a lot about how well or how fondly I feel about the next 2. The Bends, number 2. I think I said at the beginning of this video, The Bends was the album that got me into Radiohead. I bought it the week it came out. I remember it was maybe year 10. And I remember reading a review in Q magazine. Does anyone remember Q magazine? Which made it sound amazing. I'd never heard of this band called Radiohead. For some reason, Creep sort of bypassed me when it came out for a couple of years. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention to, alternative radio in the early 90s as much as I should have been. But The Bends was my first experience with Radiohead, and man, I mean, this is possibly one of the most stunning albums of the 90s, I reckon. Sort of revolutionised rock music after the demise of grunge. Grunge had sort of died by the time The Bends came out. 95, I think. Was it 94 or 95? 95, I think. They sort of reinvented possibilities, like what rock music could do after people didn't really know, after the death of Cobain, and that was sort of symbolic for the death of the grunge movement, if you like. So this was sort of a signal that the Brits might have had the solution, I guess. And of course, the rise of Britpop at the time sort of helped position Radiohead as serious contenders, but of course they weren't Britpop. They They were doing something very different to the British bands of the time, like Oasis and Blur and Pulp. And this album sort of proves that. I think the influences that they're drawing on throughout the album are vast. And they were looking overseas. They weren't just looking at British music and singing about British issues. They were looking at a huge diversity of, different musical contexts and different lyrical ideas that weren't just sort of mindless sort of patriotism associated with Britpop. And it's quite an album. Still, all these years later, it's one of my favourite sort of guitar albums. And of course, you know what's number one. OK Computer just has to be, doesn't it? This was I think one of the early reissues, maybe. But of course, I should also mention the version that came out last year, the OK Not OK version. I'll hold it up there. It's 1997 to 2017. So the 20-year anniversary edition, which has the extra material. It's got I think 11 extra tracks on this one, which is fantastic. I won't go into detail about every track on OK Computer, but I will say that I bought it the day it came out. Huge amounts of nostalgia, sentimentality attached to the album. I remember buying the CD and putting the CD in the car CD player in the 90s. Everyone had one. And having to pull over to the side of the road as soon as the first minute of Paranoid Android was going. Airbag had already played and I was blown away and I could still drive at least, but after the first minute of Paranoid Android, I just had to sort of pull over and digest this thing because I felt like I couldn't sort of focus on the road and this intoxicating music at the same time. I'd never heard anything like Paranoid Android, and that experience sort of has stayed with me. I think the power of that moment with that new song sort of showed me and sort of still tells me how much power music can have over a person if you tuned into what the artist is trying to do or trying to say and how they're trying to say it and what they're using to try and say it. You can have those experiences pretty regularly, and I've fortunately had a lot of similar experiences with music since then. It's a challenging listen. I think it's again meant to be a challenging listen, but it's a really rewarding listen. I think it's something. I mean, it's hard to articulate what it is about OK Computer that does it for so many people, but I think it's the fact that all of the musical elements in that album, melody, harmony, rhythm, timbre, texture, all these things combine in such a pleasing way. I think there's the right amount of everything, Some melodies have too much. Some songs have too much melody. Some songs have too much, they prioritise rhythm too much or they prioritise texture too much. OK Computer seems to prioritise them all in just the right way, It's the sort of magical, the golden mean, if you like, of where these elements should be for sort of the ideal listening experience. Something like that, it's really hard to sort of properly talk about because it's music. But OK Computer, it's been written about so many times. I should just stop talking about it because we know it's amazing. Folks, that's it. That's my Radiohead worst to best. I would love to hear your worst to best. Leave it in the comments. Tell me where I went wrong for you. I'm sure I've offended lots of people in placing some of these albums, so please tell me how I offended you. Please hit subscribe if you have not done so already, and I'll see you next time. Bye.